wanted to thank you both. And earlier on, you mentioned Lisa Nandy. I just want to let everybody listening know that in line with our transatlantic ambition, we're actually doing a session with Lisa in 2 weeks' time, where she will be speaking to the Deputy Secretary of State, Bill Burns, who served under Obama and who is tipped for high office under Biden. We'll be continuing to do such transatlantic sessions. But before we go into that, and before I introduce our next session on India, thank you so much, Annalise, and thank you so much for moderating this so wonderfully. I may have to call upon you again. You're obviously such a natural pro at this. Thank you both, and thank you, of course, all the MPs. I noticed that we had 3 other MPs. We obviously had Naz, we had Yasmin, both of whom have been part of the Concordia network for almost 10 years now. But we also had Abena. I don't know if she's still here. Noticed that we had Abena Apong, a new MP.
Hi, I'm just listening.
Hi, Abena. Notice you joined. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you to all the MPs who took the time out. Thank you again, Annalise Dodds. Thank you again, Shahab. And you're listening to the Concordia Forum's 14th session on distant socializing. We're now moving towards our next session, which is going to be looking at the rise of fascist tendencies in India. It gives me great pleasure to introduce us to our next host, Professor Saeed Khan, who has, of course, been involved with our organization for over 10 years, since our inception. He will introduce the rest of the panelists and take it from here. Over to you, Professor Saeed. You need to unmute yourself.
Right. Thank you so much, Mudassir. Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be in the world today. Thank you to Concordia for, again, the vision, Mudassir, not only for the organization, but for the foresight of recognizing how very important these kinds of engagements really are, and to see it grown out. To really then mine the talent that's out there is really very heartening. So today's session is on the rise of fascism in India, as Mudassir said. A bit of background about me. I'm a senior lecturer in Near Eastern Asian Studies and Global Studies at Wayne State University in Detroit, where I'm also director of Global Studies. And I know for many of you, the subject of India is deeply personal because of either ancestral, immigrants, family, ethnic, religious, and cultural ties. But it is also, given the size, scope, and scale of the country, something that certainly does impact the consciousness of many of us. We will hope to try to cover the complexities as much as possible, but time, of course, is not on our side. And I apologize in advance if we don't give due attention to any one particular area that may be of primary concern to you. But hopefully you will appreciate just, again, how nuanced, how complex and complicated this issue of India is, and one should expect nothing less for a country that is as vast and as diverse as it is. We have a wonderful panel today with 4 excellent really experts in their fields, respectively. But before I begin with the introductions, let me, if you will allow me, have an introduction to fascism. It's a term that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It tends to get used, perhaps misused and overused quite a bit as a kind of a colonial term, especially when people are angered at what they see as a certain kind of expression by state actors. It's important to realize that fascism has certain qualities to it. And if we are going to go ahead and understand what's going on in India, perhaps it's best to go ahead and at least put out the factors and then let you decide if you think that the moniker of fascism indeed applies to it. I think you'll probably find from our panelists and from myself that we've already come to that conclusion. But the idea that fascism is some kind of an anomaly that is seen as operating outside normal and conventional routes is actually perhaps one of our biggest misnomers. Fascism has historically emerged from democracies. We are coming up in 2 years on the 100th anniversary of really the emergence of fascism by Benito Mussolini in Italy. Of course, It was made most infamous and notorious by Germany under Hitler in 1933. But Japan also was involved, and of course all three countries were allied during World War II. But 1945 did not defeat fascism. In fact, in Europe, fascism persisted for another 30 years in Spain and only ended with the death of Francisco Franco. It was not defeated. So that's, I think, also an important factor to consider. More recently, in 1989, we see with the collapse and the breakup of Yugoslavia, the return of fascism and the rather brutal way that it was deployed by Slobodan Milosevic and his various actors when it came to the Balkan Wars, particularly in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And so now, fast forward to the 21st century and this delusion about whether we truly have become more enlightened, have we really learned the lessons from the past, we see then India emergent. It's fair and it's important to also point out that what is happening in India is not the only place in the world where we see these spasms toward fascism occurring. We can certainly use as examples the Philippines with Duterte, with Bolsonaro in Brazil. Some will argue Erdogan in Turkey and Netanyahu in Israel. And then, of course, in our estimation here, looking at India. So what are some of the factors to consider other than its emergence from democracy? Populism, corporatism, nationalism, which is both exclusivistic and oftentimes tied to a religious buy-in, particularly with the majority or the dominant religion there. We see militarism being another factor, oftentimes media complicity, an anti-feminist thread oftentimes accompanies this as well. And so it's important to take a look at all these factors. And by the way, if you think I'm trying to exclude or exempt the United States from that list, I would say that perhaps Trump is certainly one example of having fascistic tendencies, if not enabling it himself. So taking all these things into account, perhaps it's a good on-ramp to then have this discussion about fascism in India. So we're joined this morning, at least here in the United States, by Professor Sheetal Kalantri, who is a clinical professor of law at Cornell Law School in the beautiful city of Ithaca, New York. And I can see from her background that she, in fact, is showing that. So thank you for joining us, Professor Kalantri. She is the founder of the International Human Rights Clinic there, along with the co-founder of the Avon Global Center for Women and Justice. She is the author of the very excellent book, Women, Human Rights, and Migration. So thank you for joining us, Professor Kalantri from Ithaca. We're also joined by Muhammad Ali, who is a journalist who has written for, among other publications, The Hindu, Al Jazeera, and also perhaps most recently and famously Wired. I strongly recommend, for those of you who have not read his excellent article on the Hindu rights, particularly as it pertains to vigilante justice, so to speak, and social media. We also have from Rutgers University in New Jersey, we have Professor Audrey Truschke. She is a professor of history, most notably the author of the book Aurangzeb, The Man and the Myth, exposing the complexities of this Mughal emperor to the dissatisfaction, it seems, of people on both sides of the aisle. And of course, if you can upset everybody, it means that you're really doing your job very well. So welcome, Professor Truschke, to this. And finally, we have Ajit Sahi, who is the Executive Director of the Indian American Muslim Council, based in Washington, D.C., probably the leading advocacy group promoting the rights and the civil liberties for particularly Muslims within India, but not limited to them, also looking out for other religious and ethnic minorities. So welcome, Director Sahi, also to the discussion. So again, we have a lot to discuss and analyze and very little time. What I'd like to do then is find some place to launch this. Many of you are familiar with the fact that fascist policies oftentimes are some of the first indicators of how governments then seek to alienate, demonize, and target communities. And in India, one of these policies was the notorious CAA. And I was wondering if perhaps we can use that as a point of entry for Professor Kalantri to see how CAA was deployed, why it was deployed, and what has been its impact on various groups within India. Are you, can you unmute yourself, or would you like me to go ahead and do that? Okay.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah, I wasn't able to unmute myself. Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Professor Khan, and for the entire panelists. And I'm really excited to be here to have this conversation about India. So jumping right into it, you mentioned the CAA, right? So the CAA, as everyone is well aware, these protests erupted this year in response to the passage of the Citizenship Amendment Act. All of these were quickly quelled when the lockdown began. And these demonstrations took a violent turn in February with over 50 people in Delhi killed. Many of them were Muslims. So what I want to do is maybe make 3 points. One could talk about this for a long time, but I know I have a short period to do so. So I just want to make this, the first point is I want to argue that the CAA is really a continuation of Indian policy and is not as much of a departure as people think it is. And so the puzzle is, why is this widespread protesting? Then second, beyond the CAA, I think there's a looming concern of how India might determine who is a citizen and who is not. And this is why we need to look to Assam for this incubator, a very problematic incubator for making these determinations between citizenship and non-citizenship. And the third is, I think that a lot of these problems of statelessness and refugees could have been avoided if India signs and at this moment accedes to international conventions that define what it means to be a refugee. So with the CAA, you know, as the name implies, it amends the Citizenship Act. And I think many people may not even know really how does citizenship work in India? Well, over time, India has increasingly moved from granting citizenship by birth to granting it by lineage or blood. Residence also qualifies, like in the US, naturalization would be a way you can become a citizen. But illegal migrants, quote unquote, and this is in the Citizenship Act, are excluded from obtaining citizenship, no matter how long they reside in India. And what the CAA did was it amended the definition of illegal migrant to exclude people belonging to Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Jain, Parsi, or Christian community who are persecuted in Afghanistan, Bangladesh, or Pakistan, and who entered before 2014. And so, as you can see, notably, it's only 3 neighboring countries, and Muslim people as well as Jews as world religions are excluded from this new pathway to citizenship. But what few people know is that quietly in 2015, the Ministry of Home Affairs had already issued an order that allowed people fleeing from persecution from those 2 countries, from those religions, who could safely come into India and travel without valid passports. So the CAA was actually saying that when we allowed these people in the past, now we're giving them a pathway to citizenship. And you know why this 2015 order didn't cause as much disruption, I think, is because, one, it's not an act of parliament, which the CAA is, and so maybe it wasn't very visible. But also, I think it has to do with a proxy for the frustration with the larger Modi regime, right? He won the second time around by a large margin. He seized on this mandate to be less shy about promoting a Hindu nationalist agenda. Abdicated the semi-independent status of Kashmir. We know the civil liberties are increasingly under threat. People don't feel comfortable speaking out. And so I think that the protests were a way to a larger dissatisfaction with the treatment of minorities in India, particularly Muslims, and impingement on civil liberties. So, and the second point I want to move to, again, in the interest of time, is just to talk a little bit about Assam, right? So by way of 1 second of a background, right, in 1971, when the war between East and West Pakistan occurred, a lot of people migrated into Assam, which borders what is now Bangladesh, the northeastern state. The central government negotiated a pact with the local Assamese people that gave migrants who came before 1971 a pathway to citizenship. But since then, still the Bangladeshi Indian border is much more porous than the Pakistani border, which is highly militarized. At that time, people from Bangladesh entered without visas or any official documents. And when their children were born, there was no birth registrations because only about half of the births are registered in India. So how do you figure out who's citizen, right? People don't have driver's license or a voter registration card. Well, for this purpose, they created something called the National Register of Citizens. And this is a list of people who are compiled based on property records, voter registration, many of which are problematic for a lot of reasons and discriminatory against women and minorities, which I can later talk about. So about 2 million people were left off this list, which means that they're possibly foreigners. And many of them were disproportionately women and Muslims. Then they have to go before a foreigners tribunal and they have the burden of proving that they're citizens. So imagine a poor person with no property or, and no solid place to live has to go in and produce documents showing that they are a citizen and have been living in India. But once this tribunal determines you're not Indian, well, they remain, Bangladesh is not taking them. You deportees, you got to deport someone from somewhere, right? If you're going to get them out of your country, and which means they're a permanent underclass of stateless people who are deprived of many of the normal things that a citizen would have. And many of them are in jail and detention for long periods of time. So to conclude with my third point, and we can have a larger Q&A, one of the things I want to point out, and many people again may not be aware of this, is that 75% of the countries in the world have signed the 1961 UN Refugee Convention. So even the United States is ceded to the 68 Protocol, right? Which means that we begrudgingly do follow the rules. We've been trying, the Trump administration has pushed to the boundaries of the rules, tried to change those rules, but India has refused to accede to it. And the convention requires that signatories accept people from any country, right, from any religion who suffered persecution on grounds of religion, political opinion, identity, national identity, and a few other things. And if India were a party to this convention, it never would have given the preferential treatment to certain types of refugees that it gives in the CAA over others. But historically, India has always treated refugees on an ad hoc basis. For example, it'll accept Tibetan refugees, with the Dalai Lama making his residence in India, but refusing to accept the influx of Rohingya refugees from Myanmar. And this ad hoc treatment would be unacceptable under the major world consensus. So to some, the CAA, I think, is problematic and somewhat of a continuation of the BJP regime, but only now people are appropriately protesting against this. And I think that what we should worry about is if the process of determining citizenship using this NRC process is imported to the rest of India, it risks even more, millions and millions of more people being rendered stateless.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Kalantri. I mean, if I might just jump in on this. I mean, this notion of citizenship has become so pervasive around the world. Everyone is contesting it. I mean, here even you see in the United States what was considered to be an immutable sacred cow, if you will, of birthright citizenship. You hear spasms of debate now from the political right about whether this should be re-evaluated, whether in fact it was even intended by the founding fathers that the 14th Amendment, when it finally did come up after the Civil War, did it really intend for birthright citizenship to even be part of the calculus? I don't know if this is sort of a response to globalization, if this is just many countries that are feeling a kind of a moral panic. So I was wondering, where do you see this fitting into India's broader historical narrative, albeit one that is about a third or so the age of the United States?
Yeah, so that's an important question. So really, one can't understand India's approach to citizenship without understanding, decolonialization and partition and the ways in which it was determined who from what side of the new border is a citizen, when can they come in, when they can't come in. So initially the US Constitution bakes in this idea of birthright citizenship. And amending the U.S. Constitution is very difficult, requires a lot more consensus and buy-in than does amending the Indian Constitution. So the Indian Constitution initially had this notion of who can enter from Pakistan, even later, even after the border was done. If maybe somebody is a Hindu and they wanted to come in, they didn't move during the border. It dealt with those issues, but then it sort of punted for the future issues of citizenship. So it's not baked in. That's why you have this act, and this act can be fairly easily amended. In any way, the Indian Constitution can be much more easily amended. It's one of the largest constitutions in the world and the most amended. So seeing it from that history, India has always said, well, we refuse to sign these conventions because we have to deal with citizenship in our own different way. We have people from other countries, we've had partition, we've had terrorism. So I think you're right to say that this is, and Assam is its own situation where Assamese who ethnically are different than the people who are coming in and felt like their own identity was being taken away by the influx of refugees.
Okay, thank you. This notion of a historical narrative, every country has one. Sometimes it is even considered to be a bit of a creation myth. One of the central features, it seems, in fascism is the revisiting of these kinds of historical narratives, the creation myths, and a kind of revisionistic history comes in. And it seems as though in India, there has become an even bigger surge of this. So I was wondering, Professor Audrey Trushke, I know you've done a lot of work in trying to provide greater clarity for history. And obviously, the history of India goes far beyond 1947 and its independence from the British, going into, for example, this period of the Mughal Empire, and even well beyond that to the time of the ancients, the time of the Vedic period as well. So I was wondering if you could provide some insight as to why now, and why the kind of historical revisionism and the kind of shape that it's taking on, particularly in either contributing to or encouraging fascism. Let's see if we can go ahead and unmute you there.
Hi there. Thank you for inviting me to this forum. Thanks to everyone for listening, and thank you for those excellent questions. So I think, maybe one starting point to explain why the Hindu right is so invested in rewriting the past, particularly ancient India's past, is really that, while Indian history goes back thousands of years, the history of the Indian nation state does not. Right, the history of the Indian nation state goes back less than 100 years, and when you have that break, then everything before it's glorious, it's interesting, it is complicated, it is a million things on earth, but the one thing it is not is some sort of Hindu glory story leading into Hindutva. Right, that's number one thing it can never be, sort of definitionally. And so you have an attempt to rewrite it. And, my own work and research focuses largely on the Mughal Empire. The Mughals, ruled roughly, from the 16th through the 18th century. I mean, the mid-19th century in a sort of, depleted form, shall we say. And, they were sort of the biggest, best, greatest show in town when it came to pre-modern Indian emperors. And they also happened to be Muslim. And, you've really seen a targeting of the Mughals by Hindutva ideologues. And that's something that's been accelerating over the last several years. And I think that you're seeing it happen for a bunch of different reasons. One is that it's a dog whistle. Right, hating Muslims in India's past is a pretty good way to signal an acceptance of hating Muslims in India's present. Right, so it, you sort of inflame sentiments, and then you sort of signal, oh, it's okay to go out and hate your neighbors and to hate the people who live next door and the people who go to the mosque, without ever actually saying that. Crucially, right? So there's sort of a plausible deniability that no one would ever believe, if you will. I think another thing that you're seeing happening is this sort of false narrative of grievance. Right, and so the basic Hindutva story here is that Hindus have been oppressed for Indian history, particularly the last 1,000 years, right? People talk about, 1,000 years of slavery under Muslim rulers and all this sort of thing. And this is false, right? It's fiction, it's not true, but it's an attempt, I think, to justify the unjustifiable. Because there is no justification for treating Muslims as second-class citizens. There is no justification for omitting them from the Citizenship Amendment Act. There's certainly no justification for lynching people in the Indian streets. And yet, if you want to try to justify that, which definitionally cannot be justified, I think that, creating this narrative of extreme grievance, going back to sort of time immemorial, that's sort of your best shot at doing it. Maybe the last thing that I'll sort of throw out is that I think that the control over history itself is part of the game here, right? So, with any sort of fascism, and we're seeing it with Hindutva right now, you want as much control as possible, right? You want the ability to dictate what people think, what they can say, what they can do, what they don't think, what they don't say, what they don't do, and control over the historical narrative is part of it. And so long as professional historians, people like me, are sort of the ones, more or less controlling the narrative, I think you have a problem from the perspective of Hindutva ideologues, because professional historians, we essentially don't agree about anything, right? We argue all the time. Many of my colleagues don't like my work and my books, and that's all great, right? That's all in the game. But the one thing that we do agree upon is sort of the sort of ethics of the discipline, and the point being to reconstruct the past as accurately as possible, to come up with new and better interpretations, and to do it honestly. And that's a problem, right? Honesty and ethics are some of the biggest challenges to fascist ideology.
So, we're finding then, Professor Trushki, really three major points. One is the backlash against recognized methodology of scholarship. Everything seems to be outcome-based, and I know I don't have to remind you of some of the slings and arrows that you've had to experience by people who are upset that you are seemingly providing the truth of a historical narrative. The other aspect is also, it seems as though this isn't just historical revisionism, this is getting into being the outlandish. Akin to flat earth theory, the notion about how Indians were flying 3,000 years ago, interesting cures and treatments to deal with COVID-19. It seems like that's also an element of this kind of revisionism. And then finally, when you're describing the way that it is targeting a community, and as Professor Kalantri said, there is this massive and very significant colonial period, and it is the British that seem to be absent from any kind of critique or criticism as far as what their agency was in creating, or at least helping to create, India as it is today.
Absolutely, I agree with that 100%, and I wish that the British would confront their colonial past more. All of that said, I think within the Indic context, if you want to understand sort of, why is Aurangzeb, for example, targeted as opposed to Shah Jahan, right? Hindutva ideologues are no big fan of Shah Jahan, but he doesn't get nearly the hatred that Aurangzeb Alamgir does. And explaining that, you need to go back into the colonial past, right? The beginning of that answer has to do with colonial period scholarship. All of that said, maybe this sounds a little bit odd coming from a historian, because obviously I strongly believe in understanding where stuff comes from, but at some point, I think you also have to take responsibility. And it's been a long time since the colonial period. And while I think that, obviously from a historical perspective, you have to understand how it goes back, Hindutva ideologues are the ones propagating this sort of hate now. And that it first began with the British is important, but what is most important now is that they are still doing it, right? That's the key point we need to confront, so.
I remember after 9/11, there was a noted scholar who was giving a talk in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan on Islamophobia, as it was starting to come up right after the September 11th attacks. And his moderator was, and I won't mention his name because he's a quite well-known Indian academic here in the United States. He made the comment before going on to say, I'm glad you're, and I'll just say the scholar's name was Akbar. He says, well, I'm glad your name is Akbar, because if it was Aurangzeb, I think I would have a little bit of an issue. And he was trying to say it in a very flippant kind of way, but I remember thinking, oh, no, you didn't. The fact that he would kind of bring in that subtle jab, and this, of course, was nearly 20 years ago. So I think those kinds of subtle things have always been lurking around. So thank you for shedding light on that. Today, though, when it comes to the way that those subtle digs can be deployed, first of all, they're no longer so subtle, and they're also not something that takes an awful lot of difficulty to gain a wider audience by things going viral. Social media seems to be playing such a big role in fanning the flames of Hindutva and the kind of fascism that we're seeing occurring in India, among other places. So, Muhammad Ali, you wrote a wonderful article in Wired, which sheds light on this. So I was wondering if you could help us understand the role that that social media has played in creating a kind of vigilante tribalism. Oh, let me get you unmuted here. How's that?
Yeah.
Okay. I think you're back. If you can go ahead and unmute again. No? There you go. Is that it? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Concordia, for calling me here, and thank you thank you, Said, for co-hosting this thing, and thank you all the participants and listeners. Well, Said, I mean, as you were saying, I mean, social media indeed is one major reason today. It acts as a medium for the much bolder dissemination of the hatred that we are seeing today. But essentially, I mean, that's what I have been telling people also after my Wired piece in various webinars, that social media is not the reason for this kind of dissemination of hate. Yeah, it has enabled this kind of peddling of hate, but this kind of hatred was going around through RSS propaganda, through Hindi newspapers in the Hindu heartland, essentially. So it's just that social media has enabled it to a level which we cannot imagine, and with almost no accountability and control by the third party or by any authority. So, yeah.
I mean, it seems as though you're talking, social media, it seemed, was supposed to be this wonderful democratizing vessel to serve as a counterpoint to conventional media outlets, newspapers, now satellite and cable television. It seems as though one is now trying to outdo the other. There is so much toxicity in conventional media coming out from India, stories of bullying of anyone who is looking to provide a counterpoint. Right now, India is confronted with, in Ladakh, military engagement with China. China is said to have already taken about 60 square kilometers of Indian territory. That is either being underreported or it is being shelled. Statistics regarding the spread of COVID is similarly something which is being suppressed in India. Certainly violence, whether it is against a religious or an ethnic group or even against women when it comes to gang rapes that are occurring. What then is this level of complicity regarding getting proper messages and messaging out in order to prop up someone like Modi and then by extension BJP and RSS?
I think, I mean, if we continue talking about social media, I would like to take one of the, like Professor Audrey's, the very idea of rewriting of history. So social media has taken the idea of rewriting history to another level. I mean, there are lots of things which they would not have talked about and said, I mean, in their history or in their propaganda channels. That discourse, that rewriting of history goes to another level of falsehood, fake news, uh, total, playing with the truth, in the kind of messages that we have seen. And in my piece, I've mentioned the kind of things that they have, they spread around. But one major thrust of my piece was that uh, the Hindu right has not, at least in last 20 years, has not been has not been fringe, that has not been a fringe element, has not been, I mean, the mainstream media, especially the liberal elite English media, which is not read by Bharat as we say it, uh, has been portraying the Hindu fringe, organizations like Bajrang Dal, VHP, and even RSS, as a fringe. But they have never been a fringe. They have always represented that a part of the Hindu psyche which was not so dominant 30, 40 years ago. But for last 20 years, 15, 20 years, they have become very much representative of the Hindu middle class. And at least, I mean, because I was posted for the I was working for the Hindu newspaper in Western UP for 4 years, and I've been reporting on the Hindu right and sectarian violence in India for the last 12 years. So my experience has been that that at least now in last 10 years, the Hindu fringe in a way has become representative of the Hindu middle class, has enabled to dislodge all other representatives of the Hindu psyche, and has become the dominant representative of Hindu middle class. I mean, Hindu symbols, they have taken over all the, like, for example, if we talk about Western UP, they have conveniently over a period of 40 years, or 30, 40 years, especially if you talk about Bajrang Dal, which was established in 1984, I think. They have appropriated all the Arya Samaj temples in Western UP, for example, and have used those platforms to talk about hate. So, and the other thing is that during my interactions, these people told me that, I mean, the one thing they've been doing is that they have been silently working on the ground in the interiors of the Hindu heartland, a state like UP, for example. In they'll have representatives in every block of UP villages. In fact, more than one place. They're active in, I mean, in all the nook and corners of the Hindu heartland. They're active, and they're active there without seeking any fame, without seeking sort of media coverage. They have been active for last 20, 30 years. It's just that now they have gained such a stronghold, such a big stronghold, that they get featured in the Hindi press very prominently. They get featured in English press as well. But they've been active on the ground for last several decades, and their conviction is, and they've been telling me for last 10 years. I mean, and very boldly that, Aliji, India will be a Hindu Rashtra one day, and even if I live or not, even if you don't convert, your children will have to convert if you want to live in India. So they've been active on the ground, and my beef with the elite liberal Hindu liberal or the liberal English media is that they failed to take them seriously. I mean, and even now, when one of the media watchdog interviewed me, and and they were portraying the Bajrang Dal as a fringe. Bajrang Dal is no longer fringe. I mean, they have become the main arbiter and representative of the Hindu ethos in the Hindu heartland.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because this distinction between the Indian elite and the middle class, and how the middle class is now becoming this epicenter of Hindutva. So on the one hand, you have this remarkable support for Modi and for BJP policies, but yet at the same time, it's indisputable to anybody who reads the information, if they have access to it, that the Indian economy is faltering. And the whole project of Modi bringing about India, thrusting it into the world stage as being even stronger than China, is really not steeped in any kind of reality. How do you then reconcile the fact that the very people who are being adversely impacted economically seem to be some of the strongest supporters for this movement?
Well, see, the thing is, so the stream of thought of presenting India as the home for the Hindus is nothing new, and they latch onto that, and they do not care. The Hindu middle class doesn't care about development, about vikas, as it were. The manner in which this entire the Modi is represented to them, or at least the way they approach Modi, is that this is the moment that India has been waiting for. This is this, and there is a civilizational fight between Abrahamic religion and Hinduism, and this is our moment. We have to trust, and we have to push Modi, and we have to trust Modi, because he is the Hindu king that we have been waiting for, and we should be ready to do anything to let Modi and and for this moment to realize. So they don't care about anything. They don't care about economy. They don't care about genocide. They don't care about lynchings. All they care about is that we have to trust Modi, and this is the moment that we have been waiting for. And of course they believe in all the propaganda somehow, and you will be shocked to the extent of which the Hindu middle class in the Hindu heartland believes the propaganda. Urban, rural, both areas.
It's no different than what we see here with this kind of civilizational discourse regarding white America and the threat, white genocide. This is our time to prop up Trump. So Ajit Sahisab, the notion of what is occurring in India has a dimension in the diaspora. And there seems to be an awful lot of support here, whether it is a moral support, whether it is a political support, whether it is an economic support, among not just an insignificant part of the Indian American diaspora. We see this happening in Canada as well, and one suspects in the UK and in Europe. I was wondering if you could shed light with the Indian American Muslim Council, what kind of efforts you and the organization are mapping at the connection between the diaspora and what is happening in India. Oh, let me unmute you there. There you go. Up.
Hi, yes, thank you. There was a problem with the mute button. Yes, thank you so much for having me here, and thank you, Dr. Khan, and of course, hello to all my fellow panelists, Dr. Tushke, Muhammad Ali, and Seetal. Great to be here. I'm not sure if I should be talking in such great detail about what we do as an organization here. That's not a great idea. That's not a great strategy to be publicly speaking about what we are doing in the US to counter the Hindu right here. Allow me to begin by saying that I am a Hindu myself. So the beef that, and you could say I've been a Hindu liberal. So the beef that Muhammad Ali has with the Hindu liberals, I would imagine that he would count me as part of the group that he has a beef with. And of course, beef is not quite the term that he should be using. I must warn him, because that's not something that's very, very, very acceptable to the Hindu right, or even the moderate Hindus. Before I go on to answer a question, I just want to say that what Muhammad Ali said, I would like to say that it is true that far too many people in India ignored the RSS for many years, for decades. But the another reason for that was that it was never really until about the 1980s. It was the BJP RSS was not a political force. I mean, I was growing up, I'm a child of the 1960s. I was growing up in the 1970s. I went to college in the 1980s. And by the middle of 1980s, I had started working in India. And we used to laugh at the RSS. Nobody took it seriously. Nobody even acknowledged. Today, I'm astounded to discover that some of my cousins were going to Shakha back in the 1970s and 80s. But it was such a, it was really not cool to be part of the RSS. There were not people. It was really not part of the thinking. So today's people, young people today, people in their 30s and even in their 40s, I imagine, or at least in their 30s, would not know what India was like. India was a different place. The Indian people were a different people. The Indian Hindus were a different bunch of Indian Hindus, right? Back in the 70s and 80s. So at that point in time, it was such an outlier. It was such a ridiculous ideology that nobody was paying attention to it. And also, what's happening in India, as we all know, is not something that is exclusive to India. COVID-19 in India is the same as the COVID-19 in the US is the same as COVID-19 in Japan or wherever. So let's not make that mistake. I mean, just last week, I had this most troubling conversation with a Kashmiri Muslim friend who now lives in Turkey, and he was justifying everything that President Erdogan's regime does in Turkey to civil society, including the attacks on journalists and the purge. And he was telling me, you don't know what's happening with Turkey. You don't know how the Americans, how the US is conspired against Turkey. You don't know anything about Turkey. You don't know Turkish history. His standard answer was that. And I kept telling him that you are talking exactly like the Sanghis talk in India. That's something you need to understand, So this is not something that is exclusive. There is no one victim group here. It's not like there's only one people following one religion are the only victim group, or that's happening in only one society. It seems like COVID-19 is gripping everywhere. And I think that is what is happening. I can speak to you when you talk about Hindus in America, why there is such great support for the idea of, a Hindu Rashtra in India. And quite often I find people are pointing out, people are talking about the duplicity, about the hypocrisy of Indian Hindu Americans living here and partaking in the great American ideal of equality, liberty, justice, fraternity, so on and so forth. And yet at the same time, backing an idea which clearly belongs to, the first half of the 20th century, if not earlier. And the thing is, again, I would say I'm just saying, in order to understand, you need to do a great prognosis. You need a great diagnosis, right? And I think that's true of everybody. I meet with people here in America, Pakistani Muslims, who are they're so supportive of the blasphemy laws back in India, back in Pakistan, which is ridiculous. I think what is at play here, I think there's a deep sense of, I think there is an identity crisis that people are going through, the immigrant community here. It somehow is, having lived in the US for 30 years, 20 years, 40 years, 15 years, I don't know, this is of course a very subjective opinion, but I imagine that somehow there is a deep sense of insecurity and inferiority. You don't really feel quite up to, even though you've lived in America for 30 years, you still don't feel confident enough to believe that you belong to a world order, to an American dream where everybody is an equal. So you and like Dr. Trushka was talking about, this whole sense of historical, being the victim historically and being, having been wronged in the past, all of that. And that sort of plays on the mind. Also, we must understand that, and this is where I would agree with Muhammad Ali, what's happening here in America is that the Vishwa Hindu Parishad was America, if I'm not mistaken, was registered here in the US in the early 1970s. They have been at it for a very long time. These guys are like zombies. You pick out any C-grade, third-rate Hollywood zombie movie These guys are like zombies. You can't talk to them. They can't speak. They have no brains. They have hollow eyes. They just live. They might as well be dead, but they have just one purpose. They have been fed this utter total crap about, Hindutva ideology, and they live on that. That's all they know. I've had friends when I was a kid in school back in India, in a town called Allahabad in the state of Uttar Pradesh. And these guys, they don't know better than anything, So this is the ideology that the Vishwa Hindu Parishad of America and the Hindu Swayam Sevak Sangh has propagated in America for more than 40 years, especially when you are living in a place like the United States. And if you are, if you are following the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, and you are always looking for, for ways and means to connect with your identity, with your religious identity or Indian identity. And there's tons of confusion about that also, because unfortunately, unlike people like you or the Christians or Muslims, Hindus are not people of the book. There is no book. There is no one God. There is no one anything. You go go 10 miles in India and you find different gods. That's what's happening, in India. So we are not a people of a book. We don't have a clear-cut identity of any sort. Right? So what happens is that if for 40 years, all you know about Indian culture, I know so many people here in America who say, oh, we want our kid to learn Hindi, therefore we are sending him or her to that school. And what's that school? It's a stupid Vishwa Hindu Parishad front, right? It's a Hindu Swayam Sevak front. Now, up until 2002, when the Gujarat violence happened, the so-called Hindu liberal class living in America and the Muslims, Indian Muslims in America, had never felt the need to organize around some ideological principle. There was no identified. And of course, we had seen through the 1980s, the Babri Masjid movement, the demolition of the Babri Masjid itself on the 6th of December, 1992, of which I unfortunately was an eyewitness because I was a reporter right there when I saw it go down. And so we saw all of that, and yet we all believed that the politics of India was strong enough, the secular politics was strong enough to deal with that. And therefore, the organizing of the Muslims, my organization, Indian American Muslim Council itself, was set up in 2002 in response to, Dr. Khan, stop me anywhere you want, because I can talk for 2 hours, okay?
No problem. I know we got Muhammad Ali who would like to respond to you.
No, let me just complete the thought.
Finish your thought, yes.
Let me just complete the thought. So IMC was set up in 2002 in response to the violence in Gujarat, and that violence became a turning point. And let's not forget, not just in the US, which banned Mr. Modi from traveling here until he became prime minister for the next 9 years, even in India, the brand of politics that Modi represented was being rejected, not just vocally, not just politically, not just ideologically, but even by the people of India. Mr. Modi belonged to the BJP, and yet in 2004 and in 2009, 2 consecutive parliamentary elections, the BJP did not win. So I believe that there was a very clear situation. I think this all boils down to Modi. I'm just coming to the last part of it. The fact that it all boils down to Modi. It's quite like how Berlusconi was in Italy for 10, 12 years. Everybody was going gaga over him. During the time he was prime minister, nobody could imagine any alternative to him. But that's what happens when you build all your ideologies around people. This is what is happening here, right here in America with Hindu Americans. It is true that Hindu Americans are abnormally, in their largest ever numbers, supporting Modi, supporting this concept of Hindu Rashtra. I think, just to answer your question, what we are doing here in America, we are foregrounding the moral argument about the fact that this is a very clear fascist ideology. But we are also talking, because I'm based in Washington, D.C. I work with stakeholders here, such as the US Congress and the US government. And the US government and the US Congress have not particularly been known over the last couple of centuries for taking clear ideological and moral stands. It's been mostly either ideological and moral stands have also been reached from a perspective of national security and geostrategic interests. So that's the argument that we are making, Indian American Muslim Council, we are making to the political classes and to the government that, hey, you really think that, that India is going to be a great partner for you when you want to put down China? Well, think again, because India is right now burning in, it's got a raging fire. You are doing nothing to put it out. You're actually letting the man at the helm stoke it, take it further. And India is going to pretty soon become a much worse problem than Pakistan has become for you over the last 30 years, simply because you allowed Pakistan to go down that hole, that hell hole. You allowed it to happen. And now Pakistan is absolutely unusable for you as a geostrategic partner. That's what's going to happen with India. So don't think that, none of this will come to you. It will impact your own interests. So these are the kind of different arguments we make. The moral argument is for civil society, where we continue to expose who these people are, who the RSS, HSS, Vishwa Hindu Parishad of America, who these people are. The very last point I want to say to you is, please do not make the mistake of thinking that all American Hindus support the RSS and the Hindu Rashtra. That's absolutely not true. Recently, a group called Hindus for Human Rights was set up. It is amazing the kind of response that they're getting from Hindus in America. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That's definitely optimistic to hear. Muhammad Ali, I know you wanted to chime in to respond. So why don't I give you 2 minutes, and then we can move on to both Dr. Kalantri and to Dr. Trushki with some closing remarks with a couple of minutes each.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it's not more of a sort of response to what Ajit was saying, but essentially I want to say two things. One is that, see, Modi is, I don't think I want to blame Modi for everything. One, because Modi is here not because of 5 years or 10 years of what has been going on of the RSS activism. India had to face this stage. What we're seeing in India, Modi is here because the processes which RSS started, decades and decades ago, and RSS and VHP and their, over more than a dozen affiliates have been working on. India is going through this phase in history because RSS has been working on, and all those processes are culminating. They're maturing. It's more of a manifestation of all those processes being matured. So Modi had to come, and India had to go through this process. If not today, then a decade later. I mean, this is my experience as a journalist working in the Hindu heartland. One. Second, the other problem I have with the Indian Muslim diaspora here, and also the left affiliated or the NGOs working in India, especially on the issue of secularism, that it's always Muslims who were told in India that the fight for secularism is your fight. Hindus were not told. There was no deliberate war level kind of efforts among Hindus and telling them that the secularism is as important to you as it's for Muslims. Muslims mostly carried this fight. It might be led by Hindus and Hindu NGO activists, but essentially Muslims believe that the fight for secularism is theirs. I think, and somehow Hindus were not part of that bandwagon.
All right, thank you. Dr. Kalantri, I was wondering if you had any idea for, if not a vaccine, at least something in the near future, what can be done to reverse this tide that has been obviously taken quite a while to germinate in India. Okay. I think you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. So I assume you're not talking about COVID, but really talking about the repression and oppression of minorities. I mean, I think that the response to the CAA was brilliant. It was brilliant because it was widespread. There is safety in numbers. I mean, there wasn't a lot of discussion here about the fact that journalists were being targeted and killed. dissension at public universities was being targeted and restrained, and people who are the quote unquote Hindu liberal actually didn't feel comfortable speaking because they were worried about losing their jobs or being killed. The CA allowed the protests. Everyone came out in greater numbers, and there, as I said, became safety in numbers. And I also think it was a brilliant move to read the preamble of the Constitution, because who can qualm with that? They're not specifically saying, BJP, Modi government, we think you're problematic for X, Y, and Z reasons. You're just saying, these are our values, and we're just reading the Constitution. So I think all of that was fairly, I think, a good ground swelling. And I hope, again, this is the virus. Once we have a vaccine and we can be out in the world and protest. And I also wanted to just make one final point, and this is maybe more of like really the historian point, the Audrey point. I feel like when there are debates about India between the Hindu right and the liberals and whatever different sides, right? It's about history, and not just about revisionist history, but the lens of history. People who want equality, like me, who look at the lens as of today, or post-democracy, post-constitution, this is who we are. The people who don't want to look at pre-1950 partition, colonialism, Muslim rulers. So it's kind of, people are talking across each other is sort of the negative point that we need to get over.
Right, and thank you. I mean, to that point, I mean, some revisionist history is not only needed, but it's incredibly beneficial. The whole idea of subaltern history emanates from people like Ranajit Guha and Gayatri Spivak and this whole host of people saying that it wasn't just a bunch of rich lawyers that brought about India's freedom in 1947. So to you, Dr. Tresky, what's the antidote?
The antidote. So I don't know about the antidote, but I do think that the study of history can offer some hope, and that's because it offers knowledge, right? So, I was struck by something that you said Hindus are not Ahle Kitab, right? They're not people of the book. And that is true for most people today, but it wasn't true for most of India's Indo-Muslim leaders. Hindus were Ahle Kitab, right? They were people of the book. And that is incomprehensible to us today. That's really our problem, right? To expand our minds. And that's part of the promise of studying the past. This is something that, it's very, I guess in a sense, it's very personal for me, because I deal with this with my students all the time. I teach at a public university in northern New Jersey. The majority of my students are of South Asian descent, coming from all sorts of different, cultural and religious backgrounds within that broad category. And so many of them are trying to think about, what does it mean to be Indian? What does it mean to be Hindu? What does it mean to be Indian American or Hindu American or Indo-Muslim American, however they define themselves. And, my job is obviously not to tell them the answer, but my job is to give them a sort of window of insight into South Asian history. And through that window, then maybe they can see some more possible answers, right? And expand the possibilities of their mind. Because I agree, there's never been a singular Hindu identity. And why should there be? Right? Why settle for singularity when you can go with multiplicity, right? I mean, that if anything, has been the Hindu mantra over time. And so I think that can be the promise of history. And that's also what we lose when people try to flatten it into a story that justifies modern day hate. And that's what I don't want to happen.
And similarly, the complexity of Indian history. I mean, the notion that people can't even agree what's the national dish, and thank goodness that there is that kind of diversity. I want to thank all of you, Dr. Kalantri, Dr. Tresky, Muhammad Ali Saab, and Ajit Sahi, for what could easily be a day-long discussion of understanding India, understanding what is happening to India. One thing that we clearly can see is the kind of passion and the kind of concern that people have about this very important issue. So thank you for your participation. Thank you all for being on the Zoom call today. I know that the weather is getting nice everywhere in the world, it seems. And as we have the relaxation of some of the quarantining, please stay safe, please stay well, please stay sane. And I'd like to hand it over now to Haroon Moghul, who will be moderating the next session with the noted author and scholar Lawrence Wright. Take it away, Haroon.
Thank you so much.